That's right folks, we're back with a brand new episode of Box Fresh, and today we're going to be painting the commander from apparently my new favourite army, the Ultramarines. That's right, I decided to incorporate Marneus Calgar into my 2000 point Ultramarines list, and as soon as I saw him, well, I mean, it's the most codexy of codex chapters, right? Like, what are you going to do other than paint it like the box art? So I decided to reinterpret that box art my way, as I always do for these Box Fresh videos, and I want to get into showing you what I came up with. So sit down and strap in, because this one's, it's got a lot of processes. Okay, to begin proceedings, I wanted to put a pre-shade on this miniature, and I didn't really want to just take you through a bunch of footage of me airbrushing pre-shade on. If you use an airbrush, you will know this process because it's kind of the most common airbrush process. So here's just a few quick photographs of the pre-shade and what it looked like and the different stages of it and how it looked by the time I got it finished. But now getting into this first piece of footage, now I'm showing you just me filtering that pre-shade off with some Talisar Blue contrast paint. This is just a thin spray all over with that colour, just to brighten everything back up. The pre-shade tends to look a bit washed out. And you've probably seen me do exactly the same process on my Ultramarines Contemptor Dreadnought quite recently, so you'll be fairly familiar with this workup by now. I did also want to throw in just a second filter as well, just to pull the shadows up a bit more. The shadows were looking just a little bit too bright for my taste. So I also grabbed some Leviathan Blue contrast, popped a bit of that into the airbrush and just sprayed from the undersides to improve some of those shadow areas. Cloak is going to be a bit of a complicated area, and I wanted to get that done really early on, because if I made any mistakes on this cloak, I knew I was going to have to kind of correct the armor. That's probably the most likely thing I would have smudged onto, and I knew that that was going to be quite a lot of work. So I decided to do this cloak really early in proceedings, and I'm starting out just by painting on some Steel Legion drab just all over the area. From there, I'm going to do a bunch of successive highlights with Rakkar Flesh. I'm trying to keep quite linear with these highlights so that they really kind of show the shape of the folds of the cloak and stuff like that. And I actually ended up coming in after the fact and just brightening these up a little bit more, but we do want to go quite bright with these, especially because of the next step that we're about to do. From there, we're going to chuck some gloss varnish over the whole miniature, and this is because I want to do some pin lining with an oil wash. So having a gloss varnish on there just helps that oil wash find the cracks and crevices a little bit easier, makes its job a little bit easier, and so we want to get that down first of all, squirt it through the airbrush and then allow to dry. You could also do it with a rattle can, no problem at all. And then there is that oil wash itself. Now I'm using a pre-mixed one here just because I had it on hand. It was more convenient than getting out the white spirit, getting out the oil paint. But if you don't want to use a pre-mixed one, you can make one for yourself. And it's basically a two-stage process. We're going to apply it into all of the crevices first, and you're going to see that capillary action making the oil wash wick along those crevices and fill them up and look fantastic. And then we just get a brush lightly just damp with white spirit, and we use that to sweep away any excess. Very, very simple, very, very straightforward. Once that's then done, we can let that dry. A hairdryer will have it dry in probably about 5 minutes, but you can also just let it dry naturally for a couple of hours. As long as it's touch dry, the next stage is going to be fine, and that is just to apply a matte varnish over everything, just to A, seal it in, and to B, give us a nicer looking finish to our armour. Matte varnish is just going to help bring our blends together a bit more, stop those artificial highlights from the satin paint confusing our blends and making them look weird. We're going to get a much more representative image of what we've actually painted, so that's always a good idea in my opinion. Okay, now before I start doing any sort of fine or top end highlights on that armour, I want to get one of the bigger jobs done again. So I'm going to start blacking in things like the weapons, anything that I'm going to paint metallic, that sort of stuff, just with a nice matte black paint. I think I used Dragon Black from Reaper on this occasion. And just get it covering all of those areas. And then we'll start the highlighting process in earnest. And I'm actually going to keep it fairly simple because I've got all of that very sort of detailed pre-shade underneath that I spent quite a lot of time on. I'm just going to start with some Vallejo Game Color Magic Blue. I'm just going to start picking out sort of top areas, focusing towards areas where I want to build more highlight. And I've got this really, really thin here so that there is a degree of transparency to it. But I want a bit of texture at this point anyway because everything underneath is very, very smooth. So I want to kind of draw a bit of visual interest just by creating some texture. So I'm not too worried about how smooth this goes on. As the highlights continue, we're just going to keep adding white and applying thinner, finer, more focused highlights towards the tops, towards the corners, towards the edges, towards surfaces that my mind's eye thinks should catch the most light. I say this quite a lot, but I want to remind you once again, don't focus too strongly on highlight placement. There are a few key things to remember. Certain sharp edges, if you don't highlight them, for example, you'll just lose all the definition in that area. And the tops of surfaces generally make more sense to be highlighted than the bottoms in most cases. But if you really focus more on the amount of contrast that you're creating as opposed to exactly where you're placing your highlights, A, you'll have an easier time, and B, you're going to get a good result anyway, so don't worry too much about that. As you can see here, the finished result once all the highlights are on looks pretty tidy. It's quite nice. I was very happy with it at this stage, but it's time to move on to the next one. Okay, so we've got a bunch of metallics to get in next, and I often gloss over these in videos lately because I tend to use pretty much the same workup, but seeing as there's so much metallic on this and it's so central to the look of the miniature, we're going to go over it. So starting with Retributor armor from Games Workshop, we're going to base coat in all of our golds. We're going to then take some Rakeland Flesh Shade and paint that all over those metallics. And again, this is something that I've explained before, but try to concentrate a lot of shade into the areas that have a lot of texture and less shade into the areas that don't have a lot of texture. This is going to mean that the sculpted detail is pronounced more by additional wash being pushed over to the areas where there's more of it. Once you've got all of your Rakeland Flesh Shade in, the next stage is to just grab some Vallejo Metal Color Chrome. These are formulated for the airbrush, but they go on fantastically with the brush as well. You're just going to slowly start mixing it into gold and treating this like you would any other paint, pushing highlights towards the areas of focus where you want to create more light. So you can keep mixing this until you get all the way up to chrome if you wish to. I took it quite bright on this occasion, but it really is up to you just how far up you want to go as you mix this. And as you can see here for my silvers, I'm going to start following a very similar procedure just with some different paints. In this case, starting off with Vallejo Metal Color Dark Aluminium, and we're going to get that painted over everything that I want to be some sort of silver or gunmetal or whatever. And then we're going to grab some Nuln Oil and start to shade all of those areas down. Same sort of rules, being a bit more conservative with the shade on the less textured parts of the miniature and being a bit more liberal with the shade on the more textured parts of the miniature. Once I've got that dry, I can then start adding some Vallejo Metal Color Chrome into my mix again and building up highlights, building up until I'm satisfied with the level of light that I've got. Another quite important part, and we're actually getting the bulk of the work done now. This is probably the latter half of the time that I spent painting this, but that would be to focus on those reds. For the reds, I'm going to make a start using Corn Red as my base colour on this occasion. I would quite often use Mephiston Red, but I find that Corn Red as a base actually produces a bit of a richer top colour. So Mephiston will still make an appearance, but not straight away. On top of that Corn Red base, we're going to throw a Nuln Oil shade. And again, you can do an all over shade here, or you can do a focused shade. It's really kind of up to you. If you do an all over shade, you're going to do a little bit more cleaning up. If you do a focused shade, you're going to have to be a little bit more careful. Totally up to you whether you want to place it where it needs to be or just put it all over and clean up afterwards. Now to start the highlights, the first colour I'm going to bring in is Mephiston Red, and I'm actually going to mix a tiny bit of my Corn Red into this. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, Mephiston Red is a lot more matte than the Nuln Oil, whereas Corn Red still has a little bit of a sheen to it. So by mixing a tiny bit of Corn Red into my Mephiston Red, it means that I don't suddenly have this very heavy matte going over a slightly shiny finish. It's just going to make my transitions work a little bit better, make them a bit easier to go in. Also, it just means that I'm not jumping up so far in colour straight away, not trying to make such a big leap and still keep it looking smooth. And as you can see as we work up this cloak, I did want to keep things looking really smooth. The next colour in the workup is going to be Evil Sun Scarlet, and on the front cording, I'm just going to kind of place these highlights, like edge highlights really, but on the back, I'm going to sort of place where I want the brightest section of the highlight, and then I'm going to glaze up to it. And by glazing up to it, I just create a nice smooth transition into that solid highlight at the top end. We'll grab some Wild Rider Red then and we'll do exactly the same thing, just sharpening our highlights up, shrinking down the amount of space that they take up. And on the cording, these will just be edge highlights, but on the back of the cape, again, we will place these highlights where we want them and then just glaze in a transition. And then here's a little update now after some of the smaller jobs have been completed. So this is just me going around and sort of finding some of the littler things that aren't really worth giving a section in the video, getting them painted in, and then a quick update. For the whites, I just did Corax White with Apothecary White and then Dragon White as a highlight on top of that. Very simple workup. In fact, you would have seen that workup recently in my 5 Things I Love About Contrast video. If you haven't, check that one out. For my next trick, I want to start getting my blacks highlighted now. They've been sat there kind of unloved for quite a while by this point, and I was wanting to get round to them. So we're going to do the traditional sort of turquoise, slightly textured highlighting method that I really like. This is a highlighting method that if you watch this channel a lot, you will see me use regularly. We're just starting off with bright turquoise from Reaper Master series, glazing up towards some of those highlight areas, and then adding continuous amounts of white to it to get it brighter and brighter until eventually we're adding really, really pale highlights just on tips and edges. It's a very simple, very straightforward process, and I've used it a lot. It's reliable, and so I keep using it a lot. Then we've got some leathers to get in, not a lot, just a couple of little bits. So we're going to base coat those in Rhinox hide, really straightforward. And once we've got that all nicely base coated in Rhinox hide, then we'll add ourselves some Mars orange from scale 75. I really like Mars orange as a highlight to Rhinox, just because that matte finish that it has kind of really helps sell that worn, kind of dusty look that leather tends to have on its worn, ragged edges. We'll then start dumping some more Mars orange into that mixture to try and build up some even brighter highlights. And as we start to get these looking nice and bright and sharp with lots of texture present, when we get to the final stages, we'll then start just adding some iron rack skin just to really, really brighten up the final part of the workup. Okay, so here's an update now of what we're working with after all of that's done. He's starting to look really, really nice now, and he's starting to look close to finished, more importantly. The real thing that's going to tip him over to looking completely finished and to looking lovely is when we get that skin tone blocked in for his face. So I'm going to start off with reddish flesh. This is one of the Nocturna paints that are made by Vallejo. It's available in a set called Fairy Flesh Tones, I believe, but it's also available as an individual colour. And I wanted to keep this flesh work up really, really simple, so I tried something new here, and this ended up being a huge level up moment for me. For the mid-tones of the flesh, I just kept adding increasing amounts of ice yellow from Vallejo model colour. Everybody I know and their dog sings the praises of this paint, and I can really understand why. There are so many colours that you can just add ice yellow to, and it will produce really beautiful highlight tones for you. It's very good at stopping colours from becoming desaturated and keeping them looking really bright and sharp and healthy and alive. And for a skin tone, I think that's something that you often really, really want. So all of the highlights that you see me work into this now are just ice yellow mixed into that base reddish flesh. And then when I get to the really, really bright final parts, just a bit of white added to that and just a few dots here and there. And these really are tiny, tiny dots just on tips of certain areas. But this flesh workup was super simple. And as you can see here in the reveal, it looks absolutely brilliant. I'm so proud of this. It's one of the nicest flesh workups I've ever done. And it was almost by accident. So with all of that said, with all of that worked through now, and it was quite a lot of work, I probably spent about 10 hours on this, so it did take quite a long time. But we can now go to the Lazy Susan Spinny reveal video and show you our finished Marneus Calgar. And there you have it. As I said, we put a lot of work in, but I think we got a really cool end product. It is still in the sort of colour scheme of the box art. We've still followed the box art, but I've put all of those markers on there that are very definitive of my style of painting. And so what we actually got at the end there looks pretty different. It looks kind of unique. It's its own thing. And that's what I love about this series. It lets me take inspiration from something that's beautifully painted in one style and convert it into my style and try and make it just as beautiful, but using my own preferences. That's a really rewarding thing to do as a painter. And I'm not necessarily saying that you should copy the way I do it, but it's definitely worth doing this same process. Take a picture of a model that you love that's been painted in a way that you think is brilliant, and then repaint it with your own approach. Instead of reverse engineering it and trying to exactly copy it, just try and put your own spin on it. Maybe take the colour scheme and stick with that, but apply those colours in your own way and see what you come up with. It's a really fun way to paint, and this series continues to be one of the most rewarding for me to film and present to you. So if you liked this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to let me know that you liked it. And of course you can subscribe to the channel and enable notifications if you want to stay up to date when I release new content. I do have a Patreon campaign which helps pay me to keep this whole thing running and also helps keep the channel supplied with paints and miniatures and stuff like that. So if you want to pledge to that, tiers start from as little as $1 a month, and you'll find a link in the description along with links to all of my social media. So thank you for watching this one, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to get out of here now, roll the end credits and thank my existing patrons, but I'll see you in the next one.